So I hope you are all enjoying yourselves so far, and we're going to start with our second session today, which is Social Security. How big is the financing problem, and how can we pay for what we want? My name is Rohini Killen, and I'm a NASI intern with the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the Department of Health and Human Services. And I'd like to briefly introduce our distinguished panel members. So first we have Stephen Goss, who is the Chief Actuary with the Social Security Administration and a member of NASI. He has worked in areas related to health insurance as well as pension, disability, and survivor protection. He has also worked closely with members of the executive branch, members of Congress and their staff, and numerous commissions, as well as with private organizations. He is a member of the Society of Actuaries, the American Academy of Actuaries, the Social Insurance Committee of the American Academy of Actuaries, and the Social Security Retirement and Disability Income Committee of the Society of Actuaries. Next, we have Ben Veghte, who is an Income Security Research Associate at NASI. Prior to joining NASI, he worked as an assistant professor of political science at the Bremen International Graduate School of Social Sciences in Germany. His research, teaching, and consulting there focused on comparative social policy in the fields of pensions, health insurance, and anti-poverty policy. And he is currently responsible for Social Security policy education activities at NASI. Their full bios can be found in your conference folders. Following the presentations, we will have plenty of time for you guys to ask questions of our panel. And with that, I turn it over to Steve.
Great. Works presumably from here okay? Yep. Great, okay, thanks. Well, I guess I thank you, Rohini. I do feel kind of distinguished as one of the few people in the room over 30, probably. Maybe even over 42. But I do recall once in our office a while back when somebody had a birthday, one of the younger people in our office turned 25, and they says, oh, you know, I'm now closer to 30 than I am to 20. And I thought a minute, and I said, so am I. So we got a few of us in this room. But anyway, so Social Security, you've already heard a great first panel and heard lots and lots about Social Security, and you have been, I think most of you came over to the Social Security Administration building and saw the history room, you know, met with Karen Glenn and some others in our office and already heard a lot. So we'll just run through a little bit more here. Ben has, of course, the heavy lifting here and telling you about all the options. Let me just talk to you a little bit about sort of the status of where we are, because, you know, our trustees for Social Security and for Medicare come up with estimates of what the future cost of Social Security is and what the shortfalls are. In fact, we are lucky enough, actually, I think maybe that Joan Barnhart is our only former trustee here today, unless there are some others that I'm not aware of, but we're lucky enough to have actually the real deal, having Joan Barnhart here as a former trustee and a former commissioner of Social Security, who anything I can't answer, she surely will be able to. So, okay, so where are we with Social Security at the moment? Oh, good, it works. What we need to know, some of what we need to know, and much of this you've already covered, the system, what it is, how it works, solvency, the thing that we pay most attention to as actuaries, are we solvent? Sustainability of the program, what does that mean? And finally, solutions, again, that's going to be mainly Ben's turf. So the system, what it is, you've already been through this, I'm sure, in quite a bit of detail. Retirement and survivor benefits, monthly benefits first started out in 1940. We lowered the eligibility age for retirement benefits from 65 down to 62, women first, in 1957, then men in 1962. Full retirement age has been rising based on the 1983 amendments, going up from 65 gradually to 67. We won't hit that until we have people getting to 62 in the year 2022. Disability benefits started up in 1957. One of the significant things about Social Security benefits clearly is that the way they're set up, the monthly benefit level rises across generations from new people reaching eligibility from one year to the next by about the rate of growth in the average wage. And of course, after you start receiving benefits, then your benefit grows with the cost of living or with the CPI. So from generation to generation, keeps up with the average wage. And then after you start receiving it, goes up with prices. Payroll taxes, initially were only 2% of payroll, 1% for employers and employees each, and that's grown to 12.4%, 6.2% each over time. And we'll get a little bit into sort of why that has happened. Well, in terms of what the system is, This little graph is sort of useful and interesting. It shows from the concept of what we call replacement rates, what percentage of your average career earnings over your working history do the Social Security monthly benefits replace when you reach 65, assuming you wait till 65 to start receiving benefits. Now, if you don't wait till 65 and you start taking benefits at 62 instead, you get about 20% less than this in terms of replacement rates. So just sort of do the mental arithmetic on that. And one other thing that you can look at on this chart, too, is that if we don't have any changes in the law between now and 2036, we'll have about a 25% reduction in these levels because that's all that will be payable. Again, we'll get more into that as we go through time. You can see the peak level of benefits that were scheduled in law back around 1980. Changes have been made periodically since then. It was really the 1977 amendments were big ones in terms of reducing expected future benefits. We've also had a couple of changes in the retirement age that were affected by the 1983 amendments. And so you can sort of see what the benefit levels are looking like as we go into the future, just to get a sense. And you can also see what our benefit formula tailored to give a higher replacement rate for the lower earners than for the higher earners looks like from this graph. One of the other really key things to keep in mind with Social Security that differentiates it from most other federal programs is that Social Security, the OSI, DI, and also the HI trust fund, the Part A, the hospital insurance trust fund for the Medicare program, do not have the authority to borrow. Now, we all know $14.3 trillion of borrowing is what the government has done in total of this total debt subject to ceiling. The trust funds don't have the ability to borrow. In fact, the OSI and DI trust funds have a positive balance of $2.6 or so trillion right now. From the start of time, 1937, of the first taxes, accumulating over time, the excess taxes over and above what's been paid out has amounted to $2.6 trillion. And in fact, it's necessary that that be the case, because if we ever reached the point where we ran out of money in the trust funds and did not have enough taxes coming in then to pay the currently scheduled benefits, we wouldn't. We don't have the authority to do that. And the fact that this has been the case has really motivated Congress to act at the very latest at a time when we would be getting into a position where the trust funds would exhaust. You can see on this next graph, which we actually owe in great part to one of our other former members of the Board of Trustees, a guy named Tom Saving, who suggested the idea of putting a little dashed line here for the cost of the program after we have trust fund exhaustion. This is really kind of a truth in lending deal that you can see the red line over here is what the income of Social Security is expected to be in the future as a percentage of our tax base, as a percentage of all the taxable earnings that all the workers have out there, wage and salary workers and self-employed, up to the $106,800 limit. And if we express what our total income is, including some taxation and benefits revenues on the red line, you can see the blue line, which used to be below that when we were building up big trust funds. And then we're projecting that it's going to be going up above it and substantially above it through time. We are able to pay that cost as long as the trust funds are there to augment the tax revenue coming in. But in 2036, we project that we'll run out of the trust fund reserves, and then we'll only be able to pay what the solid blue line suggests. We'll drop down to just what the continuing tax revenue coming in would allow us to do. The cost of the system, so-called, is that dashed line, but if you can't pay it, you can't pay it. And under current law, that is the wall that we would hit. We'd only be able to pay about 77% of the scheduled benefits in 2036 if changes aren't made between now and then, and that would drop down to about 74%. That's pretty flat. That's about 3/4 of scheduled benefits that we'd be able to pay after trust fund exhaustion in 2036. On this next chart, we really show kind of what solvency is really about. Solvency, because we don't have the borrowing authority, is really just a matter of, we usually define it as, are you able to pay benefits in a timely fashion and in full, the full scheduled benefits? If you can do that, meaning really that the trust fund has to be positive, you have to have money in the trust fund to be able to pay those full benefits, then we say we are solvent. And you can see here the trajectory going from the 2010 to the 2011 trustees report, the new one with the solid line, that we are a little bit worse off in the 2011 trustees report, the most recent scoring under current law. You can see the OESDI, the black line. We usually look at it on a combined basis, even though the trust funds really are legally separate and must be considered that way. You can see our exhaustion date did get to be a year earlier, from 2037 to 2036, not a big move. The OESI fund all by itself went from 2040 to 2038, and the DI fund stayed at 2018, but of course 2018 is a lot sooner than 2036, so attention will have to be paid one way or the other to the DI fund by 2018. You can see a little hiccup back there around 1994 on the DI trust fund ratio, where it was heading down really quick, and then it pulled back up. What happened at that time was a little reallocation of the total OESI and DI tax rate between the two of them to kick more of the OESI tax rate over to DI. That put them more on an equal footing, and as you can see, pulled the DI trust fund back up. Not to as good a position as the OESI trust fund, but good enough to still stay above zero to be able to pay the benefits in full. We're going to reach another point like that in 2018, and will the Congress at that point decide that they're going to do something more comprehensive reform for the overall OESI program as a whole, which you will be deciding how you would do that later today, or will they just do another little fix like they did in 1994 to make DI continue on? But that is what it looks like for solvency for Social Security under our current projections under current law. So if the trust funds exhaust in 2036, then by law we can only pay about 3/4 of the benefits, as mentioned. One question is, has this ever happened? Have we ever really hit this wall? And the answer is no. We've come close to it before, but it really, really is true that having a wall like this, having the American people know that if those 535 people up the street here don't actually pass a law to make a change, to either put more money on the table or reduce scheduled benefits, then they're going to drop and drop for everybody who's in current receipt of benefits. That really has been more than enough to motivate Congress to actually act in time. You can look at negative cash flows that have actually happened in history in the past, and you can see that around 1972, the 1972 amendments, which actually created a new benefit formula that was sort of unstable and was unsustainable. We don't have enough time to really get into detail on that, but we could at some future date if there's interest. You can see how the cash flow for Social Security went negative. We started really paying out more benefits than we had coming in taxes for a while, and that went on for a number of years from 1972. And it got really bad towards 1977 when we had the most significant amendments probably ever enacted to Social Security, other than starting it up in the first place. In 1977, really a lot of extra revenue and a very, very large reduction in the trajectory of future benefits happened in the 1977 amendments. And we started to pull back up from negative cash flows at a certain pace. 1983 amendments did more, increased the retirement age and several other features that you all are familiar with, like taxation of benefits, the revenue coming to the trust funds. And that pulled us back up to the position of very positive cash flows that we've had ever since about 1983 all the way until very recently. And that's why we've had the big trust fund buildup. If we look forward, adding now the future projection, what will happen to cash flows, we're projecting that the cash flows, and this is based on a 2010 trustees report. The 2011 trustees report wouldn't look much different. But you can see our cash flows are looking to be negative going into the future. We're going to move back into a position of very substantially paying out more than we have coming in taxes under current law. If nothing happens, we can actually sustain that until 2036 under current law, because we have the trust fund reserves to draw on to augment the taxes coming in. After 2036, though, trust funds would be used up. We'd only have the taxes available, paying about 75%. One of the key things here is that at that point, because we do not have the legal authority to borrow, that means that, in fact, even though budget scoring conventions, the way budget scoring convention is done both at OMB and CBO, they act as though we would continue paying full scheduled benefits, and that the Treasury would borrow from the public enough to be able to give free general fund money, actually loan general fund money, to the trust funds to be able to continue to pay benefits. This does put out the picture then when you see these things about deficits and debt, about how they rise up really high in the future, and that is motivation for a lot of people to want to consider making changes. I think some of us think, though, that there's probably a stronger motivation is the idea that everybody receiving benefits in 2036, including 90-year-old grandmothers, as the old story goes, would have a sudden drop of 23% in benefits. And that actually historically has been the real motivating force to get people to act, and act quite quickly. Now, sustainability of Social Security and Social Security benefits, there really evolved to be a couple different meanings on this. One meaning is well, are the currently scheduled benefits sustainable with the currently scheduled revenue? Well, obviously, as you've seen in the earlier slides, the answer is no. The currently scheduled tax revenue with the system we have is not enough to pay for this currently scheduled benefits. But there's another more fundamental question. Is the system, as we know it, fundamentally unstable, unsustainable? And when you look at the cost of the program and you look at some of the changes that would be necessary to fix it, I think most people conclude the system per se is not unsustainable. It just needs some adjustments. And if you look at this graph, it gives us a sense of what that is. A really unsustainable system where now we're expressing the cost and the income of Social Security as a percentage of gross domestic product, which is the way people tend to look at the cost of federal programs in general. We can see it's been about 4.3% of GDP for a long time, from 1975 all the way through 2008. It was just hanging in there at around 4.3% of GDP. And it's rather quickly rising up to 6% of GDP for reasons we'll talk about in just a minute. But the key thing is it's stable. It's not one of these things where it goes to 6% and then 12% and then 20% and just keeps going up. That would be unsustainable. But this system, I think to most people, doesn't look unsustainable. It does look as though you can't afford to have the cost of the program that much above the income of the program for a sustained period, so something has to be done to make adjustments. But the structure of the program certainly is retainable with making some changes. So why is the cost jumping up like that? Well, the most fundamental thing is another graph that you can look at that has sort of the same shape but in flipped form. The ratio of the number of workers covered under Social Security that potentially pay taxes in to the number of beneficiaries. And if you look after 1975, you can see this incredible stability of about 3.3 workers per beneficiary from 75 through 2008. And then it suddenly drops over about the same 20-year period that the cost of Social Security is rising up. We put a line there by the earlier period that people sometimes cite about the really high ratio of workers to beneficiaries. That was the early part of the program where all the workers were paying in, but initially to get benefits in 1940, you had to have worked for 2 years between 1937 and 1939, and how many people 85 and 90 years old back in 1940 had done that? Not very many. So we started out with very few beneficiaries. So it's only after 1975 that this chart is really meaningful in looking at this. I won't really go through this because we clearly do not have time. This is something Virginia Reno and I have talked about a lot, and we think we sort of filled in all the little pieces now about explaining why it is that in the future we are going to be in a position where the revenue that we have scheduled is about 33% shy of, well, we would have to raise it by about 33%, or the benefits, we'd have to reduce them by about 25% in order to make the adjustment to get things back in sync, or do some combination of the two. And there's a lot of sort of interesting stuff in this. I hope you will sort of take a look at your packet later and sort of go through this. In terms of understanding why we have this sudden rise up in the cost, it's really just because we have a shift in the age distribution of our population. And age dependency ratio is just the ratio of the old folks, 65 and over, divided by the number of working age folks, 20 to 64 in our population. You can see how incredibly stable that was from 1975 to 2010. Just amazingly stable. But over the next 20, 25 years, the thing is just shooting up on us. Well, why is that? Well, it's because of birth rates. Everybody always talks about the baby boom. But, the baby boom, 1946 to 1965, 3.3 was the average total fertility rate, the average birth rate for expected number of kids a woman would have during that period. It's averaged about 3 kids per woman over the long-term historical period. But a funny thing happened after 1965, the end of the baby boom. We dropped down to about 2 kids per woman, and it stayed at that level, and we expect that it will continue to stay at that level. Shifting from all the old folks having had 3 kids to all the old folks having had only 2 kids is a fundamental shift in the age distribution of our population, not just for Social Security. This plays on Medicare. It plays on really every retirement system that we have in our whole system, whether it's public or private. So this is really the cause, the root cause of why we have this shift in cost over time. And you can see here, as we should know, that age of dependency ratio going up. We even put a little dashed line in here of what that age of dependency ratio would look like if we had no future improvement in mortality at all. And between now and 2030, you have the same boost up. So it is about fertility. After about 2030, 2035, we start to get some separation, so mortality improvement does start to have some impact and some extra cost. So what do we got to do? We do need to eliminate the 2.22% of payroll shortfall, which is about 0.7% of GDP on average over the next 75 years. Sustainability will depend on timing and trend, and the changes that we need, and I think we'll probably not get into this so much in the afternoon, for sustainability, timing and trend does matter. And that's why we look not only at the 75-year actuarial balance, but when we work with members on the Hill on plans, we also look at something called sustainable solvency to make sure that, that the timing of changes that we make will be in sync so that the income and the cost will be reasonably in sync and be able to sort of work in the future. And the very last slide I've got, just under the wire I hope, is a little graph that recants the one that we have, well not recants, but brings back the one that we have, the blue line for Social Security, but also puts up the other big entitlement program, Medicare, which ever since the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, you can see what has happened with the Medicare line. We had exactly the same graph a couple of years ago before the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, and the red line, you can see how it's rising up from 1970 out to about 2010, 2020, 2030. It just kept going on up. The Affordable Care Act, as it's projected in the intermediate assumptions of the trustees, is now leveled off, and both programs are projected to be about 6% of GDP. So again, the question for you all to speak to the members of Congress who represent you is, do you want the kind of benefits that are scheduled for these programs? And if so, are you willing to pay 12% of GDP for these two programs? If you're not willing to pay 12% of GDP, then you're going to have to cut back on what the programs provide. And really the arithmetic is that simple. So this afternoon, and from what Ben's going to put forth now, I'm sure we'll get a lot more into the details on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Well, as will become apparent by the end of my presentation, the heavy lifting was done by Steve, and mine is the easy lifting.
There you go.
Okay, so I'll do it from here as well. Happy Bastille Day, everyone. Hopefully this won't be as bloody as that was. And I wanted to thank Derek Joyner and Adam Juta for doing so much work, and everyone else on NASI staff for organizing this. It's a great event, and it's a pleasure every year to see so many young people interested in Social Security and its finances. It's a fun thing to work on. It may not seem that way, and hopefully you'll feel that way by the end of the day, but you'll see after lunch it's fun to try to balance the program's finances. It's kind of like a puzzle with many pieces that you can assemble as you wish, which you'll be doing yourselves at your tables after lunch. What I'm trying to do now is sort of give you the cafeteria, the options of the menu of options that you can work with after lunch to either raise revenues or cut benefits to balance the system out. Or you could actually also enhance benefits for certain targeted groups if you think that's appropriate, and then raise additional revenue to pay for those benefit enhancements. All that is up to you, or it's up to Congress. It's not rocket science. Steve already covered the rocket science part. But it's important, and I'm glad that you're here to work on it. Social Security, as Steve pointed out, does not need more money now. It needs more money down the line. After 2036 is when the shortfall begins when the rubber hits the road on that, and when our ongoing income isn't sufficient to pay scheduled benefits. So we have between now and 2036 to come up with solutions and start to implement them so that the problem isn't as severe 25 years from now as it would be if we waited until 2036. Back in 1983, Congress acted prophylactically to put the system on a sound footing for a long period of time, and it would be prudent for us to do the same within the next few years. As Steve pointed out, this has nothing to do with the debt crisis that we're currently in, or deficit crisis, because Social Security doesn't contribute to the deficit or debt. But it is an important program that's important to millions of Americans. Over 50 million Americans are beneficiaries, and most of us pay into the program. So it's important to get it right. I won't cover the finances because Steve already did that better than anyone could. So let's start considering benefits. The first issue is adequacy of benefits. Do you think benefits are sufficient the way they are now? Do you think that they should be enhanced? When you come up with your plan to ensure Social Security solvency, you shouldn't just think about money, you should also think about the program itself, right? If you're planning defense policy, you don't start out with, well, how much money do I have, and how can I spend it on weapons? You start out with, what do we need? What are our national security threats? How much do we need for a war in Iraq, Afghanistan? How much do we want to pay the troops, their medical benefits? All of those factors, you consider all of those factors before you turn to the budget, right? In Social Security, that's in any public policy, education, environment, you should start out with the policy substance itself and then turn to the financial issue, right? So with Social Security, the key issue is adequacy. What are the needs of us as we become perhaps disabled or elderly, or if we were to die and leave dependents behind? How much money would we want to leave behind for our dependents? How much money would we want to have if we become disabled? And how much money do we want to have in retirement? And how do we want to provide for that? Once you think that through, then you can decide how much you want to pay in every month in your payroll taxes to finance those, to insure yourself for those eventualities. So why do we consider Social Security adequacy? Because beneficiaries depend upon it. Nearly 2 in 3 retirees get half or more of their income from Social Security. Okay, nearly 2 in 3 get half or more of their income from Social Security. So there's a lot of talk sometimes about Bill Gates and Warren Buffett not needing Social Security. Well, that may be true, but they're a very small portion of the population. 2/3 of Americans need it for the bulk of their retirement income. And almost 1 in 4 Americans get all of their income from Social Security. Okay, so some people, for those people in particular, even a minor cut can really hurt them, because if they're living on the average benefit's $14,000 a year, and for those people who depend completely on Social Security, their average benefit is certainly lower, maybe $11,000 a year. Even a minor cut, it really hits them. So that's why we think about adequacy when we start talking about Social Security reform. How could existing gaps in adequacy be mitigated? Well, there are several ways. There are several, people have been thinking about this for decades, and there are various groups in our population which are particularly vulnerable to poverty and the consequences of poverty. The first group that you could, in your reform package, if you wanted to target, include some benefit enhancement, you could target benefits towards the oldest old. Income and the prevalence of poverty among the aged rises. The prevalence of poverty rises with age beyond 65, as people stop working, as perhaps their spouse dies, as their health care costs increase. In 2008, median income of those 80 and older was only $19,000, and 20% of those 80 or older were poor or near poor, even by our current extremely stringent poverty measure. Any of you who've worked with our poverty measure know that that measure doesn't really measure the real poverty experienced by individuals, but it's a statistical artifact from the 1960s that hasn't been changed. There's a new poverty measure being proposed experimentally right now, which it's worth looking into if any of you are interested in anti-poverty policy. In any case, even by our current stringent poverty measure, 20% of those 80 and older are poor or near poor. Several reasons for this. Why, as I mentioned, your spouse may die. You had a 401k plan, but it's depleted by the time you're 80. They're not. If you had a pension, which most people don't, it's not inflation. Typically, corporate pensions are not inflation adjusted, so they lose half of their value over, I believe, 20 years, half of their real value. So by the time you're 80, Social Security is often the only thing that you can count on. Options 1A and 1B in the fixing report would increase benefits from age 85 onward. So I'm referring now to options in the purple book in your folders. If you could raise that up, Will, so everyone can see. The fixing report. This is something that Virginia Reno and Joni Lavery, my predecessor at NASI, worked on for a couple of years with great assistance from Steve. Did most of the cost estimates, if not all of them, for that. And team, exactly, and his team at SSA. And that's a wonderful, extremely useful document which you're going to be using in the interactive activity. And as I go forward in the rest of my presentation, I'm going to be referring to options that are numbered in there. Now, if you go to the very back of that, what pages are the tables on in the back?
28, 29, and 30.
28 to 30 in the back. If you just go back there, you can follow me by looking at those tables, the option numbers. So options 1A and B would increase benefits for the oldest old. Another way you could target benefits if you wanted to enhance benefit adequacy would be towards widowed spouses. I won't get into the details, but widowed spouses are among the poorest poor. Options 2A and 2B would pay a widowed spouse 75% of the sum of the worker benefits earned by the two spouses. Let me give some background on that. The reason for that is that sort of, as society changes, sometimes our social programs don't keep up with it. In the traditional, think of your parents' or grandparents' generation, family structure, you had a high earner and a low earner. Typically, the man was earning more. The woman took time off to raise children. As a result, her Social Security benefit was much lower than his. She often had zeros in her record because if your benefit is based on your top 35 earnings years. If she only had 20 earnings years, then she had 15 zeros that were averaged into her formula. So in that couple, if the husband died, the woman, when he was alive, the husband and wife would get 100% of his benefit plus 50% for her, for the spousal benefit. And if he died, she would get his benefit. So she gets, that's the way it is today. She gets the 100% benefit. So she gets 2/3 of what the couple previously had. But in sort of the more contemporary family structure where both couples are earning roughly similar incomes, if one partner dies, the surviving spouse only gets her own benefit or his own benefit, which is only half of what the previous couple had as a benefit, earned benefit, right? So if you're in a traditional family structure, you get the spouse gets 2/3 of what the couple had, and if you're in a modern family structure, you only get half of what the couple had. So that's the rationale for giving any surviving spouse 75% of the combined earned benefit. So that's what options 2A and 2B would do with various permutations. Another way you can target benefits, if you wanted to target benefit enhancements, would be towards caregivers. Now, some other countries, I know Germany does this and others have started doing this to account for the fact that raising children is a familial responsibility, and there's no reason why a woman should be punished for that later in life when she retires for having a lower benefit. It should have a lower benefit. So this reform would treat a couple as an economic unit. And excuse me, that's not true. What this enhancement does is simply give the woman credit up to half of median income for the years in which she didn't work, when she had a child under the age of 6, up to a maximum of 5 years. So it gives women a very modest benefit enhancement for the years, or men, for years that a partner stays at home to raise children. And there are various permutations of this option. That's option 3. Another way you can target benefits is towards long service, low paid workers. Right now, long service, low paid workers have low Social Security benefits, and of course they're unlikely to have pensions or savings. A lifetime of minimum wage work would right now leaves one at age 62, 25% below the poverty line. So if you work for, I believe it's 30 or 35 years at the minimum wage, and if you retire at age 62, your Social Security benefit is 25% below the poverty line. So this reform this option tries to amend that. The idea being that if people play by the rules, they shouldn't live in poverty in old age. You shouldn't end up on welfare in old age if you've played by the rules and paid in and worked for 30 or 35 years. Option 5 would target a benefit enhancement towards the children of deceased or disabled workers who want to go to college. So right now, there's a child benefit for a deceased or disabled worker up to age 18, 19 if you're still in high school or in a vocational school. But with this option would allow those people to go to college, or would give them a modest child benefit of, it depends on the worker's work history, but maybe $800 a month, maybe a little more, to help that child actually finish college. Now, this was a benefit we had in place until about 1981. It was eliminated at the time, in part because the system was having financial difficulty, in part because we had Pell Grants back then, which we don't have to the same extent today, as you well know. We tend to have more loans now. And so this option would encourage or would facilitate children of deceased or disabled workers going to college. Then options 6A through C propose across-the-board benefit increases of 20%, 5%, and 2% respectively. And a final benefit enhancement in there is to adopt the CPIE as the basis for determining the cost of living adjustment for Social Security. Now, right now we use the CPIW, which is the oldest cost of living index. We've had it since World War I. It measures the cost of living for urban wage earners, but Social Security recipients, by definition, are not wage earners. I mean, there are some who are, but the whole ethos of the system is you pay while you're able to work to get benefits when you're unable to work. The CPIW, which we use to determine the cost of living adjustment today, looks at the cost of living of workers, urban workers, and so it doesn't measure the cost of living of the elderly. As a result, it doesn't go up as fast as the cost of living of the elderly. The elderly have higher health care costs. The CPIE, which E stands for experimental, but it measures the cost of living of people 62 and older. It measures the inflation in the market basket experienced by the elderly. It surveys the elderly, sees what they consume. They consume twice as much health care as urban workers. As a result, the CPIE goes up about 0.2 or 0.3 percentage points per year faster than the CPIW. So this benefit enhancement would increase the cost of living adjustment by adopting a more precise measure of the cost of living of the elderly. Now, there's another side to that argument, which I'll present later on. So if we look at a sample adequacy package, for example, if you're going to consider a set of options, you could have one option which improves benefits for widowers. That one is costed out by Steve as 0.3% of taxable payroll over 75 years. You could increase the benefits for 30-year low-wage workers so that they are above the poverty line. This one refers to the fact that by age 66, by the full retirement age, they would be at 125% of the poverty line. If they retire at age 62, they would be exactly at the poverty line. You could provide student benefits for deceased or disabled workers so they can receive benefits as long as they're in school until age 22. And you could give a credit for up to 5 years of child care. If you gave all of those enhancements, that would cost 0.74% of taxable payroll on average over 75 years. So then Steve told you that there was a shortfall over the 75-year period of about 2.22% of taxable payroll. Well, then you would have to add that 0.74 to that, and now you have a shortfall that's a little bit over 3% of taxable payroll. So that would mean you've upped the size of the bill that we're going to have to pay when we consider solvency options. So this is just one sample package. You can come up with whatever you want. This is your challenge. So how could Social Security's finances be strengthened? Well, there's two ways. One is to raise revenue into the system, and the other is to cut benefits. Either way will improve the financial outlook of the program. So there are a variety of options to raise revenue. Oh, wait, did I just go too far? Yeah. Option 7, if you look at your table, would immediately raise the Social Security contribution rate by 7 to 7.2%. So it's currently 6.2. Would raise it to 7.2%. That would mean, as I said at the outset, that we all decided, or that you at your table decided as a majority that, well, we want to have adequate benefits, for when we're 80, or if our spouse dies, or if we're disabled, or all those eventualities that you're insuring yourself against through this program. If you want to have more adequate benefits, above the current $14,000 per year on average, then you could choose to pay more into the system. Okay, so you would up the payroll, the FICA rate from 6.2 to 7.2%. That's one option. You could raise it quickly or slowly. Options 7A to 7C have various permutations of that. Option 8, the set of options under 8, eliminate the cap on earned income. Currently, as Steve mentioned, the Social Security payroll tax is only levied on the first $106,800 that you earn in a year in wage income. It doesn't tax unearned income, just wage income or self-employed income. You could raise that cap to a higher number to capture what it used to be that 90% of all wages in the economy were covered by the Social Security tax base. Now that's down to about, 83, 84%. If you raise the cap to, say, $175,000, I guess this is roughly, they're different estimates, but what would you see? How far would we have to go to get 90% again?
Right now, probably around 180.
180. That would mean that you would pay taxes on the tax base. You would pay that 6.2% of your income up to that 180. That would give us, again, capture 90% of the earnings in the economy or wage earnings, and that would go far in ensuring the solvency of the system. There are other options. You could extend Social Security coverage to newly hired state and local government employees. Right now, some of them are in the system. Some of them have their own pension plans. You can include them in the Social Security system. If you do that, that improves the financial outlook over the next 75 years because those people are all paying in anew. But then, after 75 years, we get the hit because they're retiring and collecting benefits. So it improves this. It's kind of a robbing Peter to pay Paul thing, but it helps us over the next 75 years. You could treat all employee payments into salary reduction plans like 401ks. Right now, when 401ks were introduced, Congress was careful not to have them hurt Social Security. So even though you get an income tax deduction for your 401k contribution, you do not get an exemption or income tax exemption for your contribution. You do not get an exemption for a Social Security tax exemption for your 401k contribution. So when you put money into your 401k, you're investing in your retirement through the 401k, but you're still also paying your FICA tax on that, so you're earning a higher Social Security benefit when you do so. So that keeps the two systems from being trade-offs. This option would apply that same logic to other salary reduction plans like commuting costs, health savings accounts, things like that, so that when you deduct from your paycheck to put into those kinds of purposes, you're not leaking money out of the Social Security system and hence out of your future retirement benefits. Another option under 11A and B would be to use progressive taxes to cover Social Security's legacy costs. So you could, for example, the legacy costs are the costs that were incurred in the beginning of the program when the greatest generation, the World War I and World War II, veterans, the time they collected more than they paid in because they'd only been paying in for a few years, and that's termed. Peter Diamond and Peter Orszag in a book. I don't know if they coined the term, but they referred to that as legacy costs. And those legacy some people argue that even though Social Security's finances are supposed to be a closed loop and not interact with the federal budget, that you could consider having a special surtax on adjusted gross income over a certain level in order to have a progressive way of paying those legacy costs rather than having average workers pay those legacy costs on their bottom 106,000 of earnings. So that's the logic behind that. Another option under number 14 would be to to diversify the investments of Social Security. Right now, when we have a trust fund surpluses, we invest them only in Treasury bonds, but that option would invest a small portion of the trust fund surpluses in other investments. So options. Another way to improve the solvency of the system would be to cut benefits. So you could reduce the COLA. For example, you could adopt the chain CPI-U. That is a lower COLA, and it uses the logic that when prices go up for one item, you tend to buy less. In response to inflation, you buy less of the items that went up, whose prices went up more, and you buy more of the items whose prices went up less. And so the argument there is that your market, instead of the cost of your market basket, the amount of money you pay doesn't really go up proportionally to the increase in price of your market basket because you change your market basket based on inflation. And you end up buying things that you preferred less, but because they're cheaper, you buy them. And you ultimately have a lower cost of living because you substitute. That's the argument behind the chain CPI-U. And so if you adopt this COLA, you would be following that logic. Of course, the chain CPI-U is based on all urban consumers. It's not based on the elderly. It's another question whether the elderly substitute to the same extent that all urban consumers do. But that's a separate issue. We don't need to go into detail on that. There are other ways you could cut benefits. You could increase the retirement age further beyond 67. You could lengthen the career average earnings period. So you could say that instead of basing your benefit on your top 35 years, you could base it on your top 40 years of earnings. Of course, that would penalize anyone who gets a PhD and stays in school too long. Or you could reduce benefits for new beneficiaries. There are many ways to do that. Progressive price indexing and so forth. So here's some sample solvency options, just a couple of the options that I mentioned with their cost as a percent of taxable payroll. So if you add those up together, you look at a package, you can't see the whole slide there, but you have the current deficit, then you add up the adequacy choices plus the 2.22% shortfall we already have, and you could say for example here 2.96% of taxable payroll that you need to finance. Well, you need to finance that by increasing revenues or cutting benefits. So on the left column, you see various options for increasing revenues or cutting benefits, and together they have to be sufficient to bring the system into balance. In other words, at the bottom of your spreadsheet, you should be above 0 as a percent of taxable payroll. So I will stop there. And after lunch, you're going to have another presentation. which will you'll have a brief. Carrie Bowen will discuss the interactive activity which you'll be doing, where you'll be putting together your own package of options to bring the system into balance.
So thank you very much, Steve and Ben, and I'm sure now you guys can see just how many options you have to work with. There are a lot. So now I'd like to invite those of you with questions to get the attention of one of our volunteers with the microphones. So raise your hands, and they'll find you.
I'm curious.
Sorry, could you also just introduce yourself?
Okay, sorry.
Sure.
My name's Heidi Reynolds-Stenson. I'm a research intern at the Institute for Women's Policy Research. And I was curious, so I know there's been the periods in the past, and either one of you could answer this, in periods in the past when there has been, a need to change the way things are calculated or change policies to prevent a shortfall. And what I've heard has always been that those changes were always cuts, right? I guess I'm curious if there have ever been in the past when facing the kind of situation that we're facing now, that were there ever changes that were made that actually on the revenue side rather than on the cut side? Is it always, this kind of situation, has it always resulted in cuts?
Well, historically, it's probably been pretty much 50-50. I mean, we've had lots of changes. Remember, the initial tax rate for Social Security was 1% for employers and employees each. It's now 12.4%. The 1977 amendments, I think, raised that tax rate fairly considerably. And then the date at which the full 12.4 would come into play was moved a little bit sooner in the 1983 amendments. In addition, the taxable maximum itself, which is now at 106.8, was raised back around 1978, 1980, so that it reached, as Ben pointed out, the point where we had about 90% of all the covered earnings taxed in 1983 and 1984. It's slipped since that because of the so-called dispersion of earnings. The 1983 amendments also subjected benefits themselves to tax, which is arguably almost like a little bit of a means testing thing. And what was clever about that enactment was that the revenue that is generated by that goes to the trust funds. We get most of it for the USDI trust funds, and the Medicare Part A trust fund gets some of it too. There have been a number of things that have been done on the revenue side. Also, another thing on the revenue side is to expand the number of people that would be covered under Social Security. There was a time when federal civilian employees were not covered at all. 1983 amendments, I think it was, had anybody hired after 1983 is covered under Social Security, and that brings in more revenue. So there have been it's been reasonably evenly balanced about more revenue versus reductions in benefits.
Hi, my name's Laura Gage. This is for either of you. If you were to line up change CPI and CPIE side by side, what is the real difference between them? Is it just that CPIE accounts for healthcare cost, or what is the difference?
There are two differences. One is the reference population, and one is the way they account for substitution. The reference population is, and I think those are the two standards by which you should judge any CPI on the accuracy of it, right? So I mean, the standard for judging CPIs is not whether they're high or low, but whether they're accurate, because they're supposed to measure the cost of living. The reference population is one dimension of accuracy, and CPIU measures all urban consumers, about 87% of the population, and the CPIE measures the elderly, 62 and over, who are, and you can argue that the disabled have a similar cost structure as the elderly in terms of high medical costs and so forth. So that in terms of one difference then is in terms of the reference population. The other is how they account for substitution. This is the more controversial aspect. A lot of it, most economists tend to prefer chained CPI, chained indices, and chained indices account for substitution between types of goods to a greater extent than the CPIE does, and the current CPIW. What they do, they account for the fact that, for example, when certain categories of goods, when the prices for certain categories of goods go up, then you buy less of that good and more of other types of goods. So if home heating oil goes up, and you end up buying, less home heating oil and more groceries, for example, and if you just heat your home less, ultimately that means you're buying less home heating oil, and the chain CPIU would say that your cost of living didn't go up as much as if if as the CPIW, for example, or the CPIE would report. Because the CPIE and the CPIW have fixed market baskets, and they measure how that market basket, what kind of inflation hits that market basket from point A in time to point B in time. Whereas the chain CPIU measures how much you consume at the end of a time period and sees if you've changed your market basket on average. And if the market basket is changed, it looks at the prices in those for that market basket. Actually averages the prices for that market basket at the beginning and the end of the time period. So the second dimension in which they differ is how they account for substitution. The chain CPIU accounts to a greater extent for substitution than does the CPIE.
If I could add just a little bit more in addition to what Ben mentioned on that, way back when, 10, 15 years ago, a guy named Mike Boskin headed up a commission for Senator Moynihan talking about various biases as he described in the CPI. And the so-called substitution bias was one of the ones they hammered on. And there were actually two different kinds of what they've heard as substitution bias, lower level substitution and higher level substitution. Lower level was within these something like 231 broad categories of goods and services. Our classic example is if Red Delicious apples go up a lot in price and Macintosh don't, we probably stop buying those Red Delicious apples and buy more of the Macintosh. This is really shifting your distribution of purchases for really closely substitutable goods and services. That's already in the CPI. It's in all the measures of CPI. That went in some years ago, so that's already a done deal. The so-called upper-level substitution is across these 231 broad categories of goods and services that I guess personally I don't tend to refer to them as substitutes, because if you talk about what was your example?
Home heating oil.
Home heating oil versus the groceries, if you buy less home heating oil, that doesn't fill your stomach, et cetera, et cetera. So these are really not substitutes. I think it's maybe more appropriate to refer to what we're talking about now with the chain-weighted versions of the price indexes to say this is an adjustment for the redistribution of the purchases that people make, not really substitution per se. And one of the questions that arises, and I think Ben alluded to this before, is do different segments of our population have more or less ability to really reweight and to redistribute their choices over time? What is reflected in we estimate about 0.3 slower growth rate in prices if you take into account the fact that people shift away from what they used to buy towards stuff that isn't growing as fast in price. If you have some parts of the population that really don't have the ability to do that as much as other parts, then they would potentially be disadvantaged by using the chain weight CPI.
I know earlier, Ben, you mentioned that the Social Security issues don't contribute whatsoever to the deficit or the debt. And 2 days ago, Obama made some announcement that said that he cannot guarantee Social Security checks will be available come August 3rd if there's no deal reached by August 2nd. So if it doesn't contribute, how can he make such a statement? And if you could just clarify something along those lines.
No, I'm not going to do that.
Well, we certainly don't have enough time to get into all the sort of like really fascinating sort of budget stuff about the on-budget, which Social Security is actually not even a part of. I mean, by law, there's the on-budget and then there's this off-budget stuff. You've probably heard of the off-budget is Social Security and the Postal Service. So really, Social Security shouldn't even be counted in budget stuff. But I remember when that was first enacted to have that separation, some clever member of Congress said, as long as people know how to add two numbers together, you can imagine the rest of it. Yeah, the unified budget concept would continue, and it has. So Social Security is included in that. So when Social Security, which it did in 2010, start to run a period now where we're going to have less tax revenue coming in than we're paying out in benefits, it does contribute towards the unified budget deficits. Not by a big deal, but a little bit of a flip. $1.5 trillion annual unified budget deficit. We're going to have maybe I'm saying it's $1.5 trillion. And we're going to have for this year, for 2010 and 2011, something like $40 billion of negative cash flow for Social Security, less than $20 billion for years 2012, 13, and 14. I mean, it's a drop in the bucket. The debt ceiling, though, is sort of the other issue that is really kind of a question mark here. The total debt subject to limit, which is what the Congress is going to have to struggle with, what they're struggling with right now, the total debt subject to limit isn't just the publicly held debt out there. It also includes the money owed to the trust funds, because after all, the Treasury owes money to all you who own Treasury bills or Treasury bonds or double E bonds, whatever, but it also owes money to the trust funds. So the total of that is $14 trillion. About $4 trillion of that is money owed to various trust funds. Well, the question that arises is, if we hit the debt ceiling and we can't go above the $14 trillion, can we still pay Social Security benefits? At a very sort of step back and squint your eyes kind of point of view on this, you might say, well, wait, the trust funds hold a bunch of money, $2.6 trillion, and if we want to pay benefits, we have to actually redeem a bond every time we want to pay some benefits. So let's say we redeem a bond for $1 billion. That actually, the good news is that actually lowers the total amount of debt that Treasury owes to folks, because they will then owe $1 billion less to the Social Security trust funds. That actually brings down the debt subject to ceiling. However, when they redeem that bond and to come up with the cash to pay our beneficiaries, they have to come up with that money somewhere. And the way they do that is they would have to issue $1 billion worth of bond to the public. So it'd be kind of a swap. We'd have $1 billion less owed to the trust funds, $1 billion more owed to the public, but there is a timing issue. And this is where the people just a couple blocks up the street here are struggling with this. This is fortunately way above our pay grade and outside of our realm of responsibility. The folks at Treasury and Bureau of Public Debt are the ones that really have to make the decision about whether or not they can really make this happen. And that's why we're struggling a lot now. And the President's talking about we can't guarantee it and it's not clear. I think they're working on it as we sit here today to figure out what would really happen. But let's really all hope that it just doesn't happen. We've never hit there. We've never hit it before. We've never hit the debt ceiling. Let's hope it doesn't happen. But if it does, it's going to be real interesting to watch.
Yeah, hi. My name is Barry Dallin. I'm from the Alliance for Retired Americans. We were talking, this is just going back to the chain CPI.
Sure.
You were talking about accuracy, specifically in terms of consumption patterns. I think it's pretty fair to say that a chain CPI does not accurately reflect the senior population's consumption patterns. And if anything, it's going to have a detrimental effect on them, because you can't really say, you know, the senior population, the main thing that they're acquiring is health care. You can't really say, well, you need this service, you should go and get a cheaper one. So my question is, you know, I forgot the name of it, but I know there is a CPI that is geared specifically towards the elderly population. And my question is, why has that not gained more momentum? Why aren't we talking more about that? And if it does gain momentum, is it costly and whatnot? So that's my question.
Well, I mean, first of all, it's the chain. When you say chain CPI, it's always important to say chain CPIU, right? Because that's the key. Right. That your argument right there was that it doesn't represent the cost of living of the elderly. Well, there could be a chain CPI that does represent the cost of living of the elderly. You could have a chain CPIE, right? So the key is the E versus U versus W. The current one is the W. Stems from World War I. The U is a newer one, which is all urban consumers. And then there's the E, which is a new one, which is focused on the elderly. So you can pick between W, U, and E, whichever you think is most accurate. Now, it would seem like the one that measures the cost of living of the elderly is the most accurate, because that's what we're talking about in this program, the elderly and the disabled predominantly. And then the other question is whether or not to chain it. I forgot the end of your question there. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to know if you do switch to the chain.
Oh, well, right. Why haven't people been talking about it?
Population, is that going to be costly, or would it not reflect better on the senior population?
Sure. Sure. I mean, it's a little bit costly. I mean, we have cost estimates there's an addendum to the fixing report that you have in your folder with 3 new options, and one of them is to adopt the CPIE. It costs, I don't have the exact cost estimate in my head. Maybe it's 0.35% of taxable payroll. Steve has all these in his head, of course. Probably wakes up at 3 in the morning with cost estimates. Actually, he has emailed it to 2 in the morning with cost estimates. Sure, I think the reason why it hasn't been discussed more is because it does cost money, right? And in the current budget environment, most politicians are opposed to any options that cost more money. But you know, the nice thing about today is that you can decide yourself what kind of combination of adequacy and solvency measures you want to incorporate into your solution. There are some people who have been advocating for this change, for the CPIE rather, since it was invented as a basis for the cost of living adjustment for Social Security, but they have not been able to prevail.
If I might just add, we actually do have one member of Congress who did put forth the CPIE, and we did a formal estimate of it at that point, where the changed CPIU, we estimate that that'll be about 0.3 slower growth, and that price index, the CPIU, we've estimated to be about 0.2 faster growth going forward. Cost about 0.35, and that's included in a bill by Representative Ted Deutsch. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He had the other part of his bill was to unlimit the taxable maximum for Social Security, and he does get to solvency for 75 years. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, fortunately, we have Chris Chaplin here, who not only has all the numbers in his head, but generates most of them for our office, too.
All right, I think that's all the time we have for questions, but I think both Steve and Ben will be around for a little bit longer today, so if you have any others. So can we thank our great panelists? So next up we have lunch, and we will reconvene at around 12:15 so that we can get ready to kick off our interactive activity by 12:20. So Ben shared some options with all of us about what we can do for adequacy and solvency. So after lunch will be our chance to put those to good use. And you'll be sitting at an assigned table, and you'll be working out how to fix Social Security. So have a good lunch. And NASI interns, if everyone could meet downstairs for a short meeting. Thanks.
Well, I was nailed. I'm divorced.